Thanks to everybody for coming over so you can see the screen. It will be important tonight. So again, if you can't see it from where you're at, you can go ahead and move, and we won't point at you or anything like that. Okay, I might, but. So tonight is going to be a little bit different than what we've been doing over the past few weeks. We've been showing you the 3-act structure of Mark. And of course, it has a prologue and 2 interludes as well. We're going to be talking about that tonight. But we've been going through Act 1 over the last several weeks. And we've been asking a question. What was that question? Who is Jesus? That's the question we've been asking. And last week, Richard finished off Act 1. And so it's a good place for us to pause a little bit. Yes, we're going to be looking at the text, but we're going to be focusing more on the overall structure of the book and less on any one particular text. And hopefully, once we've done that, you'll see why it's important to talk about the overall structure of Mark. You might be surprised to find out that there's a lot of debate among scholars over the structure of Mark, over how to break it down into sections. There are some scholars who say that it has no structure whatsoever. Some of these people are very denigrating toward Mark. They look down on Mark and they say, oh, it has no structure. There are others who are a little bit more kind, who say simply that Mark only wants to give the most important stories. You can look at them individually, and he puts them together like pearls on a string. That's the term they often use. And it's this idea that while Mark isn't necessarily focused on an overarching structure, he's still a good writer, and he's still putting something together that's worthwhile. And then there are others who would say that the end of Mark is what's most important, that Jesus' death and resurrection on the cross is really what this story is all about. It's a passion narrative of the last week of Jesus' life. And then everything before that is simply a long introduction. There are some who say that. There's a lot of debate, a lot of different ways you can go about it. And so you might wonder why we went this route. I think I kind of forced Richard into it, but he's gone along with it, which I appreciate. But you might wonder why do we go this particular route? Well, I hope at the very least that even if you're having a hard time seeing the overall structure, at the very least you realize that there is a structure in place. Last week, Richard talked about the repetition in chapter 6, verse 30 through chapter 8, verse 30. And this repetition, as you can see on the screen, at the very least, this shows us that Mark has an overarching goal or overarching theme in mind, that he is using an overall structure. So let's talk about what I would present as the structure of Mark, and it doesn't just come from me, it comes from several sources, but one particular source we're going to talk about tonight is a more recent one that a book that I've started reading called Isaiah's New Exodus in Mark by Ricky E. Watts. This was published in the 90s. And it's widely regarded as a very good breakdown of the Gospel of Mark. And in my own reading of it, I'm not quite done with it, but in my own reading of it, I have to say he presents a very compelling argument for how to answer these questions that scholars have asked over the years. How does Mark break these stories down? How do they connect to one another? Well, his answer, the answer that Watts gives, is that the answer can be found in the book of Isaiah. That there is a deep connection between Mark and Isaiah. This is the idea. And this can't be denied. In the book of Mark, Isaiah is the most quoted Old Testament prophet, quoted more than all the others combined in the Gospel of Mark. Also, he's the only prophet who is named in Mark. When we read Matthew, a lot of the times Matthew will put the name next to the quote, where Matthew will say, as was fulfilled by what the prophet Isaiah said, or what the prophet, this, that, and the other said. Mark doesn't do that. Mark only does it once, at the very beginning of his gospel. He starts off saying, as was said by Isaiah, and then he doesn't do that from then on. And I think there's a reason for that, which we'll look at. Next, Isaiah shares many common motifs with Mark. And we're going to talk about those in more depth and detail. Excuse me. But let me just give you his overall argument. And by the way, as I go through this, I'm going to be depending on everyone's memory of what we've talked about so far in the class. Because I'm hoping that you have a good memory of Act 1. And we can use that to build our knowledge of the overall structure of the book, okay? So, again, this is a little bit different than usual, so I hope that you'll come with me on this journey. We're going to be looking at his argument for how to break this book down into 3 acts. So he calls it the new Exodus in Mark. What does that mean? What is a new Exodus? Or Isaiah's new Exodus, to be more precise. Well, it goes back to the Exodus story, which we all know from the book of Exodus, which starts with the people of God in Egypt in slavery and bondage. God comes forth and brings out judgment upon Egypt, gets them out of there, sets his people free. He parts the Red Sea on their journey out. They stop off at Mount Sinai, but then they are off on a journey into the Promised Land where they have to go through the wilderness. And once they finally get to the Promised Land, that's when the covenantal promises are starting to finally be fulfilled. Now, that structure you could roughly break down into 3 parts. Act 1, which is the actual deliverance from Egypt. Act 2, which is the journey to the Promised Land. And Act 3, which is the arrival in the Promised Land, when the covenantal promises are fulfilled and the land is actually given to them. Now, what Watts presents is this idea that in the book of Exodus, in the book of Isaiah, we have a new Exodus of sorts, especially in the second half of Isaiah, chapters 40 through 66. There is this second Exodus, of course, with regards to the people of Israel in exile in Babylon. So it's this idea that Isaiah is speaking to, and it's not necessarily Isaiah, it'd be many years after him, but he's either speaking prophetically into the future toward people who are in exile, or it's his followers who are taking up his mantle, so to speak. But they're speaking to the people of God who are in exile in Babylon. And they're using the same imagery to describe how they're going to escape from Babylon. And it's given the same 3 parts. This idea that God is going to come upon them, his presence is going to come back, and in his power and in his might, he's going to set the people free as a warrior would. And he's going to also act as a shepherd and guide his people through the wilderness. And Isaiah presents it as, well, we'll get into that in a second. But then there is this journey toward Jerusalem where God is leading his people. And what Jerusalem are they going to? They're going to a city that had been destroyed. But in this case, it's a renewed Jerusalem. Now, when we read Isaiah chapters 40 through 66 especially, but really the whole book of Isaiah, these images are brought forth. In other words, Isaiah is using their foundational story, the foundational story of the Exodus, as an image to capture what they're going through at the time. Does that make sense? Is everybody with me at this point? So there's the first Exodus, and then there's the new Exodus, as Isaiah speaks of. But when we read through Isaiah, you might be expecting that them actually getting back to Jerusalem is when the second Exodus actually is finally fulfilled. But what we find is that it's really not, because the people of God are still in sin. They're still doubting God and his wisdom. And therefore, Isaiah looks even further into the future, saying that there will come a time in the future when God will come and deliver his people and bring them to a new Jerusalem. And this, of course, takes on a much more symbolic language. Now, the idea presented by Watts is that when we take this theme in Isaiah, we can actually overlay it onto the Gospel of Mark. That's the idea here, okay? And we're going to look into some of the more details, but I just want to make sure we understand this here at the beginning. That yes, there are prologues and interludes, and the prologue and the interludes, they only underscore this idea. They really emphasize it. But it's the same idea. Act 1 is where Jesus is in his ministry surrounding in the surrounding areas of Galilee. And while he's there, we've been asking the question, who is Jesus? Well, Watts would argue that the answer to that question is that Jesus is being presented as that deliverer of the second Exodus. Is everybody with me so far? Okay. Act 2, which is what we're getting into now in Mark, is what many scholars have called the journey to Jerusalem. And all of these stories in these chapters 8:27 through 10:45, all of them take place, in essence, on the road, where Jesus and his followers are walking, they're journeying toward Jerusalem. And as they're going, certain themes are going to reveal themselves and become most important. But Jesus is teaching them as they go along. And that term, road or way in the Greek, is especially important in this section. It's repeated over and over again, and it's emphasized. So we're meant to notice. And this is why scholars over the years, even before bringing Isaiah into it, this is why scholars have sectioned off Acts 2 and said this is the journey to Jerusalem. It's because of that use of the word way or road. And it's constantly showing up again. Now this act is, of course, bracketed by two different stories. The only two miracles where Jesus heals a blind man in the Gospel of Mark. So that's going to become important later. Any questions so far? Okay. So I think the easiest way to really get on board with this idea is to look at some of the evidence he presents. And it starts with the prologue, the very first sentence, in fact, of Mark. So go ahead and turn there. Or look on the screen. Mark says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, just as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, Behold, I am sending my messenger before you, who will prepare your way, the voice of one calling out in the wilderness. Prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." The very beginning of the second half of Isaiah starts with this verse right here. Prepare the way of the Lord. It's this idea in Isaiah that the people need to prepare themselves for God's coming in and his presence being there and delivering them into the second Exodus. So it's not a coincidence that he's quoting from the very beginning of this second part of Isaiah. But he's not just quoting from Isaiah here. He's also quoting from Malachi and Exodus. And it's very interesting that he brackets those two verses with a reference to Isaiah and then the actual verse from Isaiah. So he's grouping them together, and in other words, he's wanting us to view all of this through the framework that Isaiah presents. At least that's the argument, okay? Any questions now? So he starts off the gospel with this reference to Isaiah, and then he goes into one of the first stories, which is the baptism of Jesus. And it's in the baptism of Jesus we actually see several more references to Isaiah, which might fly under the radar. We might not catch them. I didn't catch them the first time, I'll say that. But when Jesus emerges from the water, look at what it says. Verse 10. "And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open, and the Spirit descending on him like a dove." Okay, these are this sentence actually has a couple of hyperlinks to Isaiah. The first one being the tearing open of the heavens. So again, just let me reiterate this. In Isaiah, there's this discussion going on of God coming, his presence returning to Israel and helping them, delivering them. And in Isaiah, he says, when the description of God coming is the tearing open of the heavens. It's a very specific word. And Mark uses this word, whereas no other gospel account uses that particular word when it comes to the opening up of the clouds or the heavens. And then also there's this other reference in Isaiah 63, which says, "Then his people remembered the days of old of Moses. Where is he who brought them up out of the sea with the shepherds of his flock? Where is he who put his Holy Spirit in the midst of them?" And I'm not a Greek expert, I will readily admit that, but one of the things that this particular author talks about is that in verse 10, when it says the Spirit descended on him like a dove, that really a better rendition would be into him. And so it's the same idea. Throughout Isaiah, there's this Spirit-filled figure who is bringing in the new Jerusalem, who is bringing in the new Exodus. And this seems to be a reference to that here in the very beginning of Mark. So why would the opening verses of Mark be important for the study of Mark as a whole? Why are the opening verses going to determine how we view the rest of the book? Anybody? Well, I think we need to realize that in ancient times, they didn't have books like we have them. Even codexes that they had weren't necessarily made so you could skim through them real quick. And I believe Mark was written on a scroll, so you really couldn't skim through a scroll. The idea here is you put your main theme, you put your main points there in the beginning of the document. And this was common practice in the ancient days. It's common practice in Scripture as well. A lot of the main themes are brought forth right here in the opening prologue of Mark. And they're going to continue to show up. But I think the idea here, by referencing Isaiah as he does, I think we're meant to view the rest of the book through the framework, through the lens of Isaiah, hopefully that makes sense. Any questions? All right, so let's look at some more connective tissue. Common motifs that are shared between Mark and Isaiah. Interesting note, almost all of the miracles, almost every miracle in Mark is in that first section we just went over. There are 3 others that we're going to see as we go through Acts 2 and 3. Obviously, the resurrection is something else entirely, but 3 not including the resurrection, okay? So you've got almost all of the miracles that Jesus performs shoved into one section there at the very beginning. And I think the reason for that is that, what's the question we're asking in Act 1? Who is Jesus? These miracles are answering that question in a very powerful and profound way. And they're presenting Jesus in a certain light. And Watts makes the argument that they're presenting Jesus in a similar way that Isaiah presents the suffering servant or the one who was promised. Firstly, as a warrior who's going to come in. Think of the Exodus, think of the power of God, the judgment that he brought upon the Egyptians. Same thing with the Babylonians. This idea that he's coming in as a warrior is very important. Also, this idea that he's a shepherd, that he's leading the people of God through the sea. And this warrior aspect is that Isaiah has reference after reference to God coming back and being before them in the pillar of the cloud and the fire and kind of being their honor guard in the front and the back. And it's this idea that as this warrior, he is escorting them into the promised land. And then the same idea, kind of the other side of the coin, is that God is this wonderful caretaker. He's this shepherd who is causing the wilderness to be filled with water. He is reshaping the wilderness. He's feeding his people in the wilderness. Now, does that sound familiar at all to anything we've read in Act 1 of Mark? Somebody want to say it? I see some nods. Go ahead. What have we read in Mark, Act 1, that sounds similar to Jesus as a warrior or Jesus as a shepherd feeding his people in the wilderness? I am giving you the last one. Feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, which Richard over the last few weeks has been really showing the importance of those two stories. And I think this is part of it. It's this idea that God is leading his people, feeding them in the wilderness, just like the manna. Just like in the Exodus story, God fed the people in the 40 years in the wilderness. He fed them with manna, bread out of heaven. It's the same idea that God is this shepherd who's feeding them as they go. Now, those are the two obvious ones. What else? Just think of any miracle in Mark, and it's probably going to go to one of these two motifs.
Well, driving out the demons.
Yes. Yeah, the calming the storm is bringing the chaotic waters, and he's making them still. That's a warrior image, especially when it comes to his spiritual warfare with the demons. That's a big one. And there seems to be a marked emphasis on demonic possession and Jesus striking the demons out as this mighty warrior. And in fact, in Mark chapter 3, there's this moment where the Pharisees are accusing Jesus of doing this through the power of Beelzebub. And Jesus says to them, several things. But one of the things he says is this quick parable where he talks about a strong man being bound before you can take the stuff out of his house. And the idea there is that Jesus is the strong man. He's tying up demons. He's just mighty indeed, and he's just, he can do whatever he wants with them. And we've seen that over and over again with the sheer power that he's had in all of his miracles. So it's this idea that he is a warrior. He's coming to free his people from evil. And in a very real sense, he's freeing them from their slavery and bondage, not of Egyptians and not of Romans like they might think, but of sin. He's freeing them from their bondage of sin. And he's taking them out into the wilderness and he's feeding them. He's bringing them to that new Jerusalem that Isaiah talks about. Everything is leading that direction. So then we also have another common motif between Mark and Isaiah, and that's constant mention of the deaf, the mute, and the blind. You might have noticed this, I don't know, hopefully you have, that as we've gone through Mark, there seem to be more stories in Mark that deal with blind, or not blind because we haven't gone over a blind story yet, but of people who are deaf. There's a greater emphasis on the healing of deaf people, on the healing of mute people. Several of the people who are demon-possessed are made mute, and that's kind of a detail Mark emphasizes that the other Gospels don't. It's this, again, I think this is bringing to mind Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 35, and this is just one verse out of several we could go to, but the ushering in of the new Exodus, the ushering in of God coming and saving his people, one of the ways it's described in Isaiah is by the healing of people who are deaf, the healing of the blind, the healing of those who are mute. So in these verses it says, "Then the eyes of those who are blind will be opened, and the ears of those who are deaf will be unstopped. Then those who limp will leap like a deer, and the tongue of those who cannot speak will shout for joy. For waters will burst forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert." Again, that idea, we're seeing a little bit of the shepherd idea in there too. But Jesus in Mark is the one who's healing the deaf. He's the one who's healing the paralytic. He's the one who's healing the blind and the mute. This idea is especially emphasized in Mark. Not only when you look at the number of stories, but when you look at their placement. And that's why I brought such emphasis toward the interludes. The two interludes that bracket Act 2, they're the only two stories, miracle stories in Mark that deal with blindness. And they're placed where they're placed for a reason. And we'll hopefully look at that in just a moment. Excuse me. In fact, let's look at it right now. In Isaiah chapter 42, sorry. Oh, you know what? Let's look at this first. I apologize. Okay. In Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, it says this. And he said, "Go and tell this people, keep on listening, but do not understand, and keep on looking, but do not gain knowledge. Make the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull, and their eyes blind, so that they will not see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and return and be healed." Okay, this is an Isaiah passage that Mark references, and we've already seen that reference in a certain place. Do you remember where? Where is this verse brought up in the book of Mark? On what occasion? Parables. Exactly, in Mark chapter 4 and verse 12. The disciples come to Jesus. They ask him, "Hey, why do you speak in parables?" He quotes from this passage. And we've talked about this several times. I hope you remember why Jesus spoke in parables. It's this idea that he's putting a buffer in place, that those on the outside aren't going to get any of the knowledge, but those on the inside will get all of the knowledge. It's kind of a very interesting thing that's taking place there. Excuse me. But he quotes from this idea that's found in Isaiah. Excuse me. Now, Jesus, what's very interesting about this is that Jesus in chapter 4 uses this verse to talk about people who are on the outside, Pharisees, people who've rejected Jesus, the bad soil. But later on in the gospel, in fact, we looked at this passage last week in chapter 8. Jesus then uses this idea to speak to his own disciples. His own followers suddenly don't have ears to hear. Their ears are dulled. Suddenly his own followers aren't able to see. They're unable to understand. In Mark chapter 8, verse 18, let's look at that. Mark chapter 8 and verse 18, Jesus is upset with them because, and hopefully you remember from last week, they're in the boat and they're complaining, Jesus tells them to be concerned about the leaven of the Pharisees. Watch out for it. And they grumble to themselves. They're saying, "Oh, it's because we didn't bring any bread." And look at what Jesus says to them. Verse 17. "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember?" So he's referencing this idea found in Isaiah, or that starts in Isaiah. And it's this idea that there's people who are just dull. They're not, and the image of blindness, the image of deafness, is used in a spiritual sense to talk about people who aren't able to understand spiritual matters. So this image, it's actually transposed onto the Gospel of Mark, I would argue. And but before we look at that, I want us to look at one more passage here from Isaiah in chapter 42. This one's very important. Chapter 42, verse 16. Again, the image is this second Exodus. God is leading his people out. But look at what it says here. "I will lead those who are blind by a way they have not known. In paths they have not known, I will guide them. I will turn darkness into light before them, and uneven land into plains." Excuse me. "These are the things I will do, and I will not leave them undone." So God is going to lead his own people, and even his own people are blind in this moment. But he's going to lead them anyway. He's going to take them along a path that they can't see. They're basically groping along. They would be lost if he wasn't guiding them along the path. This image is very strikingly similar to the image that is presented in the Gospel of Mark, especially when it comes to Act 2. So Act 2, we're finally there. It's the journey to Jerusalem. They're on the road. Every story, it's talking about how they're on the way. That word is repeated over and over again. And as they're on the way, a greater emphasis is made to show how much the disciples lack understanding as they journey. They're on their way to the great city, to Jerusalem itself. They're in Act 2 of the Exodus, but they're blind. And that's why in Act 2, that whole section is bracketed by two stories that involve a blind man. At least that's what I believe, that's the argument. A couple of other connections really quick, and then we'll look at the passage. A couple more common motifs between Isaiah and Mark that are connected to this very idea. Number one, the people were unwilling to accept salvation when it came from a pagan, when it came from an unexpected source. This is an idea we find in Isaiah, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why the true second Exodus isn't taking place yet, because they're still dull and they're still hard of heart. They don't like that God is saving them through a pagan king. So it's this idea of salvation through from an unexpected source. Also, some of the more famous verses in Isaiah are all about the suffering servant. Suffering servant. Throughout Isaiah, we're shown this suffering servant who we're told has something to do with salvation. He's the one that's the sacrifice for our sins. And obviously, when we think of Isaiah 53, we think of Jesus. And I believe that Mark, one of the main emphases of Mark is that he is presenting Jesus first as that warrior and that shepherd, but then as Act 2 takes place, Jesus starts telling his disciples about his death. He starts telling them that he's going to go to Jerusalem and be killed, and they just don't comprehend it. They're blind. They don't understand it. It's this idea that Jesus is slowly being presented as the suffering servant. And while there isn't necessarily a direct reference to these passages in Mark, there are certainly parallels that we could look at, and I think we will look at when we see Jesus' death on the cross. Of course, we understand there's parallels with the suffering servant. Okay, so the idea, hopefully you get it so far. Any questions? Comments? Okay, so that's just a brief overview of kind of the argument that this book presents. It's a very good book, a very difficult book to read, and hopefully what I presented made enough sense. But let's apply these ideas now to the text itself, because we're entering the first interlude, which is the story of a blind man being healed, and then right from there we get into Act 2, and Act 2 starts off with a bang. And everything in Act 2 deals with the same themes that we're going to see right here. So let's go ahead and read. Chapter 8, starting in verse 22. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again. And he opened his eyes, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." Okay, thoughts. What pops out at out to you from this story? Sorry?
Healing takes a double take.
The healing takes, what, a double take? It takes two healings? What's going on there? This is the main reason, one of the main reasons that people like to downgrade Mark or like to look down on it. Because this particular story is only found in Mark, and certain skeptic scholars who might not consider themselves skeptic, but I would say they are, but certain scholars will look at this story and say, that's embarrassing for Jesus. How could he mess up the first time? Oh, and so they will make the argument that Mark was written first and that Matthew and Luke saw that story and said, ugh, and cut it out. That's the argument they make, okay? I would argue that there is a grand theological point being made in this story. And it's all you have to do is zoom out a little bit and look at the context. So let's go ahead and look at the very next story. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. This is the hinge of the book in many ways. This is the hinge. Some people would break Mark down and say this is the halfway point. This is the point where Jesus finally asks the question himself. We've been asking it as we've been reading. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? And now Jesus asks it. He says, "What have you learned so far?" is the idea. We've gotten all these amazing action-packed stories from part one, and now he's asking, what have you learned from it? Have you gotten the picture yet? Who am I? And Peter gives the correct answer, doesn't he? He says, "You are the Christ." And Jesus strictly charges them to tell no one about it. It is the correct answer, especially when we look at Mark's version of the story. Jesus commends Peter for saying so. So this is the correct answer. Have the disciples are they finally able to see? Do they finally get it? Well, let's keep reading. Verse 31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man if to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words and in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed, when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." And he said to them, "Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power." We could talk a lot about some of the things Jesus says at the end, but I want us to focus really on the overarching point of all three of these stories when you put them together. You've got the story of a blind man being led aside by Jesus. He heals him, but it takes two healings. He heals him, or he touches him the first time, and what does the blind man see? Trees walking around. And then Jesus does it again, and finally it takes. That's the idea. Then in the very next story, we see Peter confessing Jesus is the Christ. It's a correct answer. He's right. Good for Peter. But Mark's account doesn't focus on commending Peter like Matthew's does. Mark instead goes straight into the next story, which is not very nice for Peter, is it? Because Jesus, once they know he's the Christ, once they've answered the question, who is he? Now Jesus can start telling them what that means. And that's really what Act 2 is all about. In Act 2, we're going to see him repeat this over and over again. He's telling the disciples, I'm going to go and die. And the disciples are blind to this idea. And I would argue that Peter sees Jesus for who he is, but really he's seeing a tree walking around. I think that's why that story is there and in this place. That Peter only has a partial understanding, as do all of the disciples. They understand who Jesus is. They don't understand the next level, which is that yes, he's the Son of Man. Yes, he's the Son of David. Yes, he's the Christ. Yes, he's the Son of God. But what does all of that mean? It means he's also the suffering servant. And that's what they can't get behind. Reminds me of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul says that the word of the cross is a stumbling block to the Jews. I think this is very much a stumbling block. And I think the whole Gospel of Mark is written to get people past that stumbling block. It's written to a Roman audience, yes, to Jews as well. But I think the point here is we've presented Jesus as God in Act 1. I think we've shown that, Richard and I, and obviously Mark himself, has shown that very clearly. But now we have to come to the hard part, which is he's the suffering servant. And for his Jewish followers, this was a very difficult thing to understand. And it still is. I've been looking... on YouTube, I've gone and looked at there's some channels that deal with Messianic Jews. And I've seen footage of people who go on the streets of Jerusalem and talk to Jewish people. And they'll read to them Isaiah 53. And many of these Jews have never heard it before. They've been told not to read it or whatever it is, but they've literally stayed away from Isaiah 53. And when it's read to them, their reaction is almost always the same. That sounds like Jesus. Wait a minute, whoa, that's in the Hebrew Bible, that's in our Bible, that's in Isaiah? And it's very troubling and sad that it still remains a stumbling block for them. But I really think that Mark is presenting Jesus as the suffering servant from here on out in the gospel. And so Act 2 is the journey to Jerusalem, and he's leading the blind along the way. That's why that act is bracketed by 2 stories of blind men. And then right after that second blind man story, they're in Jerusalem. And Jesus is fulfilling the covenantal promise in a very unexpected way by dying, by going through the suffering. And I think when you look at Mark through this lens, it was eye-opening for me. I hope it is for everyone else. But it's not necessarily the only way to view Mark, but I think it's a valid one. Any questions or comments? To view that story in an embarrassed way. It's there for a reason. It's perfectly placed because I believe it's a parable for Peter and for all the disciples. I think they are gradually being able to see more and more. But right now, they think they see Jesus, but really he's just a tree walking around for them.
Interesting thing, at least interesting to me about Isaiah, certain scholars in the 19th century decided that there were 2 Isaiahs, and that 44 through 66 is what they call second Isaiah. Some people even came up with the third. I've heard what the division is like. The Dead Sea Scrolls have 4 complete scrolls of the book of Isaiah. And in Jerusalem, there's it's not a museum, I can't remember the word, something of the book. And they have that scroll on a giant cylindrical display where one can see and read the entire book of Isaiah, one of the 4 complete.
Oh, I would love to see that.
From the book from the Dead Sea Scrolls.
So, would you say that? Well, we don't really have time. I guess I can talk to you about it after. But any other final questions before we have a prayer? All right, let's go ahead and pray. Dear Father, God in heaven, thank you for your word and thank you for the Gospel of Mark. Lord, we pray that we will have eyes to see and ears to hear your word. And help us to travel home safely and forgive us when we sin. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.